Unlocking the Future of Finance with Web3 Wales. Our moderator, who is he? Oh, it's me. So, please welcome Nicola White, Andrew Kessler, Joseph Cutler, and Brooks Entwistle to the stage. Okay, so we're going to dive in. Unlocking the Future of Finance with Web3 Rails. I'm going to start, if I may, by asking you each to introduce yourselves and also talk a little bit about what you're doing. Well, a bit longer, just a bit more about what you have been doing and how you find yourselves here. Let's start with Nicola.
Thanks. So my name is Nicola White. I'm the CEO at B2C2. We're an OTC liquidity provider. We were founded in 2015, so we've been around through a couple of crypto winters. And well, I'm sure we'll touch on some of that throughout the panel. And we trade spot, derivatives, and lending. Lending might be a dirty word this year as well, but I think there are ways in which we can do it safe, efficiently, and maybe we'll talk about some of those.
Thank you. Actually, that was probably a 7 out of a 10, and I think you need an agent. I'm sure I could do better for you, because your background is incredible. It really is. Look, I'll let it go. So now you know the length, Andrew. Go for it. You set the standard.
My name is Andrew Kessler. I'm the CTO for Zenotta AG. Zenotta concerns itself with trying to understand the role of data within blockchain space and Web3. My background is semiconductor, solid-state encryption. Did a variety of projects, come from academia. And one of the things that I encourage us to think about, and this panel discussion will really unpack that, is kind of where the overlap is between Web3 and blockchain. What are the differences and similarities? So that's where we really spend our time in thinking and the tool chain that we've developed.
Thank you. Actually, I have to tell you, I have been stalking you gently in this, because every time you open your mouth, I learn something new. So I'm delighted to have you on the panel. Joe, welcome.
Thank you.
Tell us about yourself.
Well, I'm Joe Cutler. I'm a partner at Perkins Coie. And the way I usually introduce myself is I'm a privacy lawyer by training, a blockchain lawyer by passion, and a fintech lawyer by necessity. And so I hit lightning twice as a young lawyer. First, I came to the firm as a brand new lawyer out of law school just when social media was happening. Facebook was still distributed across all of Palo Alto at the time. They didn't even have a campus. And I got to be one of the first lawyers at the firm to deal with privacy issues as they intersected with social media. And I spent several years building an enforcement program at Facebook where we went after people who were abusing other users on the platform. And that taught me about how the internet worked. And it also taught me the danger of over-centralization. And so in 2011, a partner of mine asked me to look into this thing called Bitcoin. And my first response was that I thought it was a botnet run by the Russians to crack NSA codes, but I didn't know what it was. But over time, I came to appreciate how amazing it was. And I actually pivoted my career in 2013 when the firm formed its blockchain group. And it's, I think, one of the earliest blockchain groups ever formed. And we have about 70 lawyers at the firm who practice in the crypto space.
70 in the blockchain group. Okay.
Across almost every type of practice. And we were able to help a lot of the original companies figure out their regulatory compliance needs from the very beginning. And I still have the passion for it. It's very fun.
Thank you. Brooks, welcome.
Great to be in San Moritz. I'm a Colorado guy, although I've lived in Asia for the last 30 years. So it's great to be in the mountains, and thanks for having me. I'm at Ripple. I have 2 roles there. I look after our biggest region, which is kind of everything from Dubai to Japan, up from Australia, reporting to the Singapore office, which is our big mega regional headquarters. And I also look after our global customer businesses as well. So we've had an interesting year in 2022, like others we'll talk about on this panel, but we've also been at this for 10 years. So like many people on this panel, we've been through a few of these down cycles, a few of these winters, and looking forward to learning lessons in that perspective going forward. I came at this, I was a Goldman Sachs partner and really spent most of my career overseas building businesses around the world, and then was at Uber for many years, which is one of the great scaling experiences as well as dealing with regulators in a way that was contentious, certainly at the beginning as well. So lots of similarities to this role in crypto, but most importantly, looking forward to being part of this group, and thanks for having me.
I think the regulators also learned something about how to deal with tech companies during that era. So it was particularly bold and pioneering stuff, if I remember correctly. So actually, let's stay with you, because Chris Larson came to Level 39 in London, 2014, I think it was, the first blockchain lab there, and he told me about these new rails. Okay, new rails. And I thought, oh, interesting. Who are you targeting and why? So here we are today, and the question is, old rails, new rails. Why is it taking so long?
It takes a long time to build another financial network, which I think is what Ripple set out to do. As people know, there's XRPL, the ledger, there's XRP, the digital asset, and then there's Ripple, the company, which was set up to build use cases and really set out. And Chris was an unbelievably visionary founder, still involved. We still see him in San Francisco. But this notion that cross-border payments was a utility or use case right from the very beginning. Yeah. And so we set out to do this, and as people on the panel know, and Joe's been around this, we didn't have a lot of luck early on in selling a vision of moving digital assets across a new SWIFT network early on, because a lot of the banks we went to talk to, they may want to invest in us, but they wanted nothing to do with digital assets at that point. And so we found a lot of innovative PSPs and fintechs who were willing to buy into this vision of building a now 70-country financial network known as RippleNet, which is the core business we have. We also play in CBDCs and NFTs and other things on the other side of our business. But the rails have migrated over time. That's the most important message. When we built this on fiat, we had a real use case for moving specifically around remittances or small business flows.
That's right.
But in the last year, and this is what I think is so important for this discussion these 3 days, is just a lot of good stuff going on underneath the noise. There's real signal going on. And for us, it's very simple. The number of people adapting and using our on-demand liquidity product, which uses digital assets across one country to another, really settling across the blockchain, has gone from 3 countries where we could do this 18 months ago to 40 payout countries. And the volume on the network has gone from about $1 billion US to a $15 billion run rate. So things are happening, but you asked the question, why is it taking so long? It's because building a network that has participants and entities on it that are KYC'd and AML'd and we believe in and trust takes a long time to do. Then we're going to stay at it.
And Eric, if I may, I think one thing people forget too is, so I was at Morgan Stanley for 14 years and then Citadel for 4. It's a lot easier to change things when your technology is relatively new versus you have 25 years of legacy technology, mainframes. So it's almost like these large banks and large organizations need to carve off its own infrastructure in order to make any progress. And that's what we spend a lot of time educating people on, making sure they understand the complexities of, because you're never going to modify a mainframe system or 20-year-old code and get it up to the speed and the capabilities that you need to deal with blockchain.
Well, and I also think that public perception is finicky. The blockchain revolution is going to revolutionize the world of transactions the way the internet did to communications. The internet was invented in the 60s for the Department of Defense. And it took another 20 years for them to agree on a common language, TCP/IP, and assign ICANN and IP addresses and a protocol where computers could talk to each other without not talking to each other. And then it took 20 more years to get an operating system and a browser together where you could actually go on the internet. And so when I think about sort of aging blockchain, in 10 years, we've covered a lot of that sort of metaphorical ground. And I think sort of in the long arc of things, we're kind of 84-ish, that we're still trying to invent the personal computer, right? And we're still grasping at the layer 1 for what's the common protocol.
I think, though, there's an opportunity for some layer 1s to emerge that have learned some of the lessons. Andrew, tell us what you're doing. Come on, go for it.
So that's a very good segue. Thank you very much for that, Eric. There are kind of 3 big opportunities in this space that we don't see a lot of people tackling. And the first reason is it's very difficult to tackle these problems. And it's what we at Zenotta really focus about. The first thing to appreciate is that Web3 is not blockchain. They have a lot of overlap and similarity, but you would expect from your Web3 environment built-in privacy, right? But blockchain data structures are public and should be available to anyone. Web3 should be inherently good at handling data, blockchains are fundamentally terrible at handling data. One of the things that I think is very exciting is that, just going back to the previous question and putting a slightly different spin on it, you might say, why is it taking so long? But I am flabbergasted at why it's happening so quickly. And what I mean by this is that banking and retail sectors are the most slow-moving, unchanging sectors on Earth, partly because of their business model, but secondly because of their low appetite for risk. And just if they did something innovative, all they could do is lose clients. And so if you look at how long it took to commercialize the mouse, the computer mouse, it was a 25-year cycle. We're 15, 16 years in, and already we're seeing real commitment and adoption from both the retail and the banking sector. So where can you really take it forward? Where can you really improve upon it? Going back to your question about Zenotta, we need to see a B2B blockchain emerge that isn't just focused on B2C application space, one that really understands regulatory concern. I think this was part of Ripple's mission statement, so we are related in that regard. You really need to understand the banks want to adopt crypto, but they have risk and regulation and responsibility that they have to honor and take very seriously. So we provide a legal framework, as well as a technical framework and an economic framework for B2B blockchain support. And the two other big inventions that we focus on is how do you integrate blockchains with Web3, because Web3 is infrastructure, right, in a way that blockchains aren't. If you look at Web 2, Web's an intuitive thing that you touch and you play with, but it has 4 layers. There's a physical silicon network. On top of that, you have a protocol layer. And then you have session management or presentation layer before you get to the application layer. So these 4 technologies that are disparate all come together to provide the world's most effective global infrastructure. Melton was talking about infrastructural rollout, and that's really how you should think about Web3. It's an infrastructure. So what we do is we enable two-way trades or two-way entries on our ledger as opposed to something like Ethereum or Bitcoin. In Bitcoin, you make a payment to Alice pays Bob, Bob pays Charlie. In our ledger, Alice pays Bob, and Bob can transfer to Alice a digital asset. And that's an atomic, real-time, no open position swap that happens in the layer 1. So it's trade-based, it's not only contract-based. And then the final thing that we really believe in is that files will come to represent real value increasingly over time. The one resource that grows in quantity and value is data. And so bringing data and files into a blockchain environment is going to be critical to opening up new asset classes and providing new opportunities for investment. We saw this in the attempt with NFTs. There's some panels about that later. We approach it from a file level, so that's our uniqueness.
Okay, thank you. I mean, there's an awful lot more to ask you, so make sure you're at the Q&A, the Q&A bubble, because there's a whole lot of stuff there that I've heard you talk about over the last couple of days that I don't want to spend too long on it here because they're conferences in themselves, if you like. But Nicola, I've heard you say this thing, let me find it, it was awesome. Where is it? Where's it gone? Oh yeah. So we love to work in a transactional world, right? But if you look at where wealth in economies sit, over 4 to 5 years, there's a move to a transaction-based as a goal. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's definitely one of those things that we spend a lot of time on and thought on. With blockchain technology and transactions, you're really able to, in real time or near real time transfer, right? So I was a government bond trader. I'm used to T+2 settlement. That is T+2 of credit risk that you have to your counterpart. So it's not just then about the transaction, but it's also about the credit risk you're taking, right? Yeah. So you're getting into more than what you bargained for there. And if you go and you look at some of the things that we've been able to accomplish in the last couple of years with blockchain technology, right? We're not at near instantaneous settlement yet, but we're maybe getting there. But at B2C2, we settle all of our trades typically within 15 minutes, right? So instead of having 2 days of credit risk to your customer, you're now only subject to 15 minutes, right? And so you're closer to just a transaction and not a transaction plus credit on top of it.
Is that for DVP then?
Well, I think, look, DVP is another layer on top of that, right? So if you're if you're transferring right now, what happens is one person settles first, right?
Yeah.
But there's lots of really smart companies out there right now that are talking about DVP, about doing something in a trust environment, about smart contracts that essentially you have it written in that once both of the assets are received, it automatically transfers them instantaneously. So that's another layer on top of settlement.
Right. Brooks, I'll come to you in a second, but Joe, industry's got a long way to go to trust math and code. This is your quote. Industry has got a long way to go before it can really trust math and code. What needs to happen for it to adopt that trust, to move to that trust?
Not FTX.
Yeah, good. Now we know it's not.
That's the first answer.
Yeah, okay.
But I think that the most important thing for trust to expand is real, meaningful, useful adoption. And it has to permeate either a single market very deeply or a lot of markets well enough to reach all the levels of transactions. And that's just a hard orchestration. You know, I don't think we'll ever get to a place where the common person who doesn't understand technology implicitly trusts the math alone. There will always be my grandmother who puts money in her mattress because she doesn't trust the bank. There will always be my grandfather who won't put a finger pin on his phone because he doesn't trust Apple. But that doesn't mean we can't get there. And I think the trick, frankly, is that there needs to be better orchestration between regulators who have been fomenting distrust in their rhetoric and industry who have fomented distrust by misbehavior and lack of clarity and poor explanations to make it simpler.
Yeah.
One of the worst things that ever happened, in my opinion, to blockchain is giving blockchain developers the right to name stuff. I mean, the term ICO is a terrible name.
Yes.
Right? And it's a terrible name in part because of what it connotes, right? The concept of, like I was talking about this with Marathon earlier today, or yesterday, the idea that we've called mining, you know, settling transactions. That's not what's happening.
No.
And yet it leads everyone's minds to things that then foment distrust. Yeah. So I think that the actual technology itself and the way that it works is more trustworthy than we give it credit, but we just don't talk about it very well. And that basically has a bunch of problematic children.
Is that the industry not upping its game enough to be able to beautifully articulate the way forward? Or are we just shooting ourselves in the foot with every FTX that we spawn?
Well, I mean, my honest feeling is, you know, one of my jobs as a lawyer is having to be the intermediary between the industry and the regulators, the law and the technology. And it's kind of
reassuringly paid for that. Not a happy place to be.
But that's difficult, right?
Yeah.
Because when you have a regulator come to you and say, I'll use the mining example. Yeah. The regulator comes and says, I want to regulate mining because they are in the transaction. Well, the way the industry talks about mining, it sure feels that way. But if you walk the regulator back and have a different conversation about validating states of the ledger, and not having any custody or touch to the transaction, in fact, the transaction's been presented as finished before the miner even touches it, then the regulators say, oh, I get it. We need to have that little tiny conversation 100,000 times.
Before we come to Brooks, you wanted to come back?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I want to chat. I'm curious, and we could probably spend a lot of time on this, so maybe we'll spend it in the bubble, but we're all going to spend 5 years fighting out FTX insolvency in court, right? We might not trust smart contracts currently, but we have to quickly, because I got to be honest, I'd rather put my trust in the math and the logic behind that than whatever the courts are going to decide over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I would just like to add two things. We use the term smart contracts kind of nefariously. It just points to that abstract thing over there. One of the biggest challenges that any system design level thinking encounters is complexity. How many things do you have to glue together before you have a potential catastrophe? So a way to think about this is, if you have a single pendulum swinging, its behavior is predictable, it works well, we run grandfather clocks and time on a single pendulum. If you stick two pendulums together, it turns into a chaotic system that's unpredictable. So chaining two well-behaved things in isolation together gives you emergent chaos. So reducing complexity, bringing in division and bringing in controls between components and having modular design is one way we can go to bringing about more robust and stable systems.
Better design, then.
Absolutely. So, I mean, managing complexity is an art in and of itself, and we need to do it better as an industry. I get greatly worried when customers come to us and say, well, we want to use protocol 1 to do A, protocol 2 to do B, and protocol C to do the next task in the list. Gluing these things together arbitrarily can be risk multiplicative. You need to kind of look at, firstly, the true cost of systems and the true risk of gluing things together that weren't intended to operate necessarily together. And so in our enthusiasm, things can go horribly wrong. And the next concept, which is maybe a little bit deep, but it's worth considering, in any language or speech, there are two things that we worry about. We worry about semantics and syntax. And Noam Chomsky, who you are probably familiar with, one of my fans, was asked for a quote about computer systems, to which he responded, "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously." And the people were confused by his comment, and he said, although it's perfectly syntactically correct, and although a compiler will compile it, it's meaningless. And so the problem that you have with a lot of smart contracts when you want to look at sort of smart contract behavior is that they can be syntactically correct, but be semantically flawed.
Right.
So you'll hear things about formal model checking semantics. Honestly, we haven't developed the complete tool chain as an ecosystem where we can think about modeling contract risk.
But won't ChatGPT and AI help with that?
No, that'll actually make it worse because AI as a general principle, it does pattern recognition and linear algebra, but it cannot justify why it's making the choices that it makes. It's a further level of AI works well until it doesn't.
Further level of risk.
Well, and another answer to your question, just really briefly, Jack McDonald from PolySign, I promised I'd use his quote at some point.
Okay, go for it.
Love it.
Okay.
And I think that's another way of building trust, is to do the boring stuff right, so that people, I mean, blockchain, a lot of blockchain and even Web3 might belong better under the hood to begin with.
Brooks, the question I wanted to ask you is kind of different. I want to take it to a different level because something happened in the world that made me think of you guys. China launching the CBDC. Yep. So when that happened, despite the SEC discussions that, the very exciting SEC discussions that you seem to be very good at, your organization is very good at perpetuating. It's probably the best way of describing that.
Well, thank you for putting our regulator on the screen every time we get up here. So.
Yeah, that's right. I would have put a bet on actually the US asking you folks to do a proof of concept for a CBDC. Did you, or would you?
Well, we have a very big CBDC practice. It's now globally based. We actually, within the last couple of months, have put 4 people on the ground in Singapore alone focused on this.
Okay.
It's an important effort. It's an important suite of products. I think I really, related to this point exactly, is I think as an industry, we got to be careful about chasing every single new shiny thing. It tends to dilute business models. It tends to take people off course. And we determined that in addition to our payments business, CBDCs are a very important piece of what we're going to do. However, we have found real traction with smaller governments, smaller central banks that need a holistic solution, a side chain, someone to come in from scratch.
Can you say the names for any? Or?
I can give you a couple examples.
Cool.
Since we're in Moritz, I'll give you a mountain example. Our first MOU is with the Kingdom of Bhutan, who has a very forward-looking king, technology advanced, and basically decided he wanted a better way of moving kind of value around the country, whether or not it was payments or other issues they needed to do, and also to set up a system so they could eventually have remittances back into the country as well. We're working with Palau. We're in dialogue and working with a number of central banks around the world. At the China level and at the US level, there's a lot of people chasing that and a lot of people that have their own sovereign interest in mind, and so you got to be realistic about your impact there. But CBDCs will be an important topic for the entire industry going forward, and the interoperability between them, we think, has a real opportunity for many of us around the table.
Isn't that the problem that Andrew is talking about? The interoperability is just massive, massive additionality in risk, in fungibility between different systems and CBDCs. The testing is just beyond profound thinking about how to make sure that Andrew, do you think that's a good idea, or should we go for something else?
So the first thing to bear in mind, there's a wonderful acronym. A lot of people in the audience around us are weird. and by weird I mean that we're Western, educated, industrialized, rational, and democratic. So we represent less than 1% of the worldview. There are many, a good definition for money is institutional memory. And different continents and different cultures use different forms of institutional memory to settle debt and make payments. On the African continent, they even use airtime. You can transfer airtime between parties and go and withdraw your airtime from an ATM machine. And so I would say that because the F in CfC is finance, the four big kinds of institutional memory that are worth investing in, and we should build frameworks to make these things liquid across each other and tradable, is cryptocurrencies, CBDCs, which is a different class of institutional memory, game currency, and airtime as currency.
Game currency and airtime.
So if
maybe energy?
Now that's a very interesting question. We can get to that. But in terms of keeping things simple for this discussion, if we really standardize the way that we operate with things, standardization is one of the most boring words you can say at a conference like this, but it's probably the secret ingredient to success. If we can build standard ways of dealing with these things and reduce the complexity and make these things more liquid and interoperable, then we have truly universal systems of cash. But again, you can get derailed by chasing shiny pennies. And so I think we, as a sort of a financial ecosystem globally, we should limit how much institutional memory types we onboard. And what's interesting is each type of institutional memory has its own memory management.
Yeah.
And the big difference for cryptocurrencies, what make them stand out, is they use something called a consensus mechanism to make sure that their memory management is auto-regulated.
And persistent, right?
Correct. Yeah. And that's really the big invention, which is why it's not that they're not regulated, it's that they are self-regulated.
Or in some cases, not regulated yet, which is part of the situation. Joe, I'm going to ask you this question as a privacy lawyer by training. Here we're thinking about the new Web3 rails, and a component of those rails is identity, right? There's no question it is. Digital identity, we want it to remove the friction, right? The need to do KYC every time, et cetera, et cetera. But does digital on-chain identity fit into old laws, or do we have to remake laws?
I'm so glad you asked that question.
Great.
That was really the genesis of my desire to start working in this space.
Oh.
Because as a privacy lawyer, if you think about it, I'll ask a rhetorical question. Can you name a privacy law that governs the data subject? The answer is no. Privacy laws don't. No, it governs the intermediaries that hold data subjects.
So it does, yeah.
Right? So we only apply the law when you've given your data to somebody else. And then the law is very robust, and it has all kinds of things that deal with what your obligations are. But I can do with my own data whatever I want. And so this idea of self-sovereign identity, not digital identity like taking old centralization and putting it on new centralization, that is not a solution. But the idea of using consensus mechanisms and credentialing and autonomous contracting and smart contracting have enormous promise to allow us to collect a set of credentials that we can tender on our own. And the reason that's powerful is that it will eliminate the points of loss for breach, and it will empower us to not just transact directly peer-to-peer with our value, but also we can perform our own KYC at some point. And so the hurdle is convincing regulators to accept the premise that technology that allows me to do what I want myself with my own data is outside the scope of what they normally regulate. Not that it's outside the scope of the law, but that the law has a very long tradition of not regulating that. And Eric Voorhees last night and I were talking, and he said something really fascinating. He says, yeah, it's really weird, because I presented this idea. He said, it's really weird. I can take my money and put it in a washing machine, or in a hole, or in a clock, or under my mattress, and no one regulates that. But the minute I put it digitally somewhere, suddenly everyone's amok. And so there's an interesting comparison between digital identity and digital value that I think has the same basic problem, which is when you empower individuals to own, transact with, move, store, and take responsibility for their own stuff, whether it be personal data or money, Governments, I think, freak out a little bit when it's money because their obligation is to regulate that. But they don't do that in other contexts. And so there's a great conversation to be had about bridging that divide.
So I mean, just a little bit longer on that topic, just a little bit, because it's kind of important. As someone that sits in the interface between the innovators and the regulator, and you are curating that conversation so it's meaningful and useful and get somewhere. 2 questions. What would you advise regulators to do in order to better understand and make the best of the opportunities? Okay, so that's the one question. What do we need to vote for when we're paying our taxes to be spent with the regulator to make sure they're up their game? And then the second question that flows from that is, our own experience, say, in the UK here and in Switzerland, is to do this via sandboxes, to create a safe environment where you can take an innovative idea, drop it into a regulator's sandbox, and if it goes wrong, you won't go to prison, or they limit the upside, etc. And we think that's a good way because it ups the game, we think, of the regulator. But it's actually more of like a crypto petting zoo than actually anything
Or worse, I'll answer it in reverse quickly.
Okay.
First, I think the sandbox feels more like a license. And that's the problem. You're not really free to do what you want. You're free to do what you're going to do under a lot of supervision. And that's it.
It's a small no-action letter.
Yes, I know they say we're not going to hold you responsible, but no meaningful innovator is going to go very far outside the bounds of what they're afraid of happening because they're afraid of what's going to happen. And so really true revolutionary innovation, I don't think happens easily in a sandbox. 2, what do regulators need to internalize? I personally think that regulators should approach, and DeFi presents this problem, right? DeFi truly is like, there's no intermediary if it's a pure form of DeFi. Regulators, I hope, and the conversation I'd like to have with regulators someday is, can we focus not on regulating behavior and more talk about imposing certain generic standards? And I'll give you a simple example. In the United States, FinCEN uses KYC as a proxy for how you stop crime and prevent fraud. So I have so many clients that come to me and say, well, I know I got to do KYC because I got to do AML. Whoever connected KYC as the only mechanism for stopping money laundering, right?
It's not that great at it.
But the reason is because codified in the law, there's a law that says, thou shalt, if thou art a financial institution, do KYC. If regulators stepped back and said, I don't care how you do it, but you have to prevent crime. I don't care how you do it, but you have to combat fraud. I don't care how you do it, you got to stop people from Iran transacting with US citizens as long as there's a sanction in place. That would open up almost a proverbial sandbox, which is go ahead and innovate however you want. You want to do it through transaction monitoring, enhanced
behavior
KYC,
monitoring, whatever you got.
You know, algorithmic metrics, it doesn't matter. And regulators don't think that way, and I hope that this technology forces them to start.
And I think the other thing that I would say on that front is, you know, I think regulators are always scared of new technology, but actually the benefits that we get with doing something like a digital ID are immense, right? Right now, when we KYC someone, and I get Dave Smith from LA, well, how many Dave Smiths live in LA? How many Dave Smiths live in LA that have a criminal record or have been convicted? And so you go down this rabbit hole where if you had a digital ID, there's no ifs, ands, or buts who you're facing off against. And so actually, it's our job to spend some time, and I'm sure, Joe, you spend a lot of time, educating them to the benefits of, you know, innovating a 20, 30, 40-year-old system that, to be completely honest, is a little bit broken.
Brooks, you were going to...
Just very quickly, I mean, I think this is really on us. This is a ground game. It's a global ground game to be out with regulators. That was my single biggest learning around the Uber business over these years of going in and needing to do this at 80 countries around the world and convince people that this is good for them, it's good for their citizens and the like. And it's no different with digital assets and some of the things we're talking about today. And so I think you cannot invest enough in regulatory and policy teams. You cannot be out there. We go where regulators want to hear us and have discussions. And the only observation I would have, and that's the unfortunate thing about this time, is I was at a Southeast Asian central bank 2 weeks ago on a topic, and we spent it was going to be a very innovative meeting, much like you're describing, Joe. And we spent the first 30 minutes on FTX and events in the Bahamas. And so we are going to go through this period where we got to just push through that with regulators and talk to them about the simplicity, the nomenclature, why it's beneficial for their country and citizens, and we've all got to do it together and stay on it. Otherwise, nothing will happen.
I'd just like to jump in and add one final closing remark.
I was going to ask you to do that anyway.
Fantastic.
Go for it.
Fantastic. So I think a lot of crypto enthusiasts tend to take a kind of a postmodernist worldview, where they're like, oh, who needs regulation? It's for the birds. But the regulators are really trying to sort of create frameworks and conditions for consumer protection. And there are a lot of non-technical consumers out there that do legitimately get taken advantage of. And so I think we as a crypto technology stack and a community should shoulder some of that responsibility a little bit more seriously. There's a lot of very cool tech. The way to think about it is on-chain, off-chain divide. And so if you look at things like Bitcoin, Lightning, and other sort of layer 2 and roll-up strategies, it's becoming possible now to run some of your operations, your computational operations, in an off-chain setting, and some of them on-chain. And so we should slowly start to think about what is like blockchain inherently really, really good at, transaction processing between parties. But you can use things like adapter signatures to keep the parties to the contract presentable to any judge who wants to see who are the parties and counterparties, but it can be blinded from being publicly available on the ledger.
Zero knowledge proofs or something similar?
No, it's not really zero knowledge proofs, but they do sort of contribute to this. So there are a suite of technologies where we can really improve the compatibility with the demands of the legacy world with blockchain without sacrificing the technical benefits.
Awesome. Well, look, I mean, you've all very helpfully painted a vision of the future which needs us either to help the regulator understand better, or, Joe, you could become the regulator. Come on, that would be awesome. I think they need you. Thank you very much, panel. We much appreciate it. Please put your hands together for this amazing panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.